Cuba remains an incredibly important and influential country in the Caribbean. Its problems, though, with fuel supplies, with an economy that's crumbling and a health service doesn't work, has gone on for decades, of course, though it's definitely getting worse because of the oil blockade that President Trump has imposed.
Hay muchas cosas que funcionan a través de combustible y entonces a la vez que no tenemos combustible estamos prácticamente paralizados.
A lot of people say it's worse than it's ever been. Now, the president has said that he expects to focus his attention on Cuba after he's dealt with Venezuela, of course, and Iran.
I do believe I'll be having the honor of taking Cuba.
Certainly we know that the Americans and the Cubans are talking, but what does this all mean for the people of Cuba? What will this country look like when the blockade is lifted? This is Havana, the capital of Cuba. We're 3 months into a US oil blockade, and life is unraveling here faster than anyone predicted. This is right in the heart of the city, and through the rubbish bins, they search for anything of value and anything worth eating. Some collected in bags, slowly working their way through the mounds of rubbish, seeking out discarded food and vegetables rotting beneath the blistering sun, sifting out what they can scavenge from here. These aren't necessarily homeless people, but they are desperate people. Others can't wait, inspecting the food, then eating it. It's that desperate. There's been incredible poverty here in Cuba for a long time, but this type of open desperation hasn't existed here for many years. What people have been telling me is that the streets of Havana are famous for always being really clean, even though the people are really poor. But things have got worse, and as a lady was just explaining to me, this is here because the normal refuse people, the bin men, haven't got petrol to actually come and pick up the rubbish. So I've passed lots of street corners and it's like this. Since the start of the year, the United States has imposed an oil blockade on the country, meaning no fuel is allowed in. But it doesn't mean there's just a shortage of fuel. It means that everything falls apart. There's now a growing food crisis. Cubans are going hungry. This is economic warfare, every bit as destructive to life here as bombs and bullets would be. The homeless sleeping rough in back alleys is now a common sight where it was once unthinkable. People have to queue to get money from cash machines. There's a money supply issue in Cuba, and that means there's strict limits on what can be withdrawn. Often, there is no money to be withdrawn anyway. People also queue for hours to get bread from barely functioning government-controlled bakeries. They're limited to 1 piece a person, when there is any to be had. This is a government ration shop known as a bodega. They're meant to provide essentials at cheap prices. The shelves are virtually bare. While we filmed, an emergency load of rice was being delivered. This is humanitarian aid. Cuba can't produce enough of its own. What we found was that more often than not, the bodega stores were completely empty or shut in this current crisis. Pharmacies as well have just empty shelves. This one appears to be open, but it seems there's virtually nothing in stock.
Please help me with 1 milk here.
One man, an English teacher, approached me,
asking if I had paracetamol. He explained he didn't have enough money to buy medicine or milk in shops that aren't run by the government.
I'm an English teacher. I teach a teenager in high school. But we have very few possibilities to buy new jobs, because the new market is, we can't afford. I mean, the people who live like me, like a wage, my income is 2,500 pesos like a teacher, and I can't afford to buy a new job.
With the Cuban state failing to find a way of dealing with this crisis, it's fallen on charities to provide some help. The community of Sant'Egidio charity is now trying to feed a growing number of the most vulnerable. The elderly and homeless line up for a bowl of pasta, dished up by volunteers 3 times a week. It's a lifeline to these men and women, but the charity's resources are stretched and limited.
Well, the statistics vary, but somewhere between 72% and 90% of people in Cuba live in extreme poverty. About 3/4 say that they miss at least one meal a day because they simply can't afford to buy the food. They just haven't any ways of getting to it. For these people, the most vulnerable in society, this is the absolute lifeline. This is possibly the only proper meal they're going to get today for certain, but maybe for large parts of the rest of the week.
Inaris Suarez Cardenas, the charity's charismatic senior manager, says this crisis is getting worse. They're now feeding children, opening schools and trying to provide medical care. They never used to do this before. Life has been tough in Cuba for many years, she says, but the US blockade is pushing it over the edge.
First off, how important are these meals for these people here?
Tener una buena alimentación. Es muy probable que si no almuerza aquí, cuando en su casa lo que coma es un pan solamente. No es que un anciano pueda tener recursos económicos como para almorzar, desayunar, comer, merendar. Entonces esto es como, no es una gran ayuda, pero es algo que por lo menos reciben una alimentación.
There have been periods of time where there have been crises in Cuba's history, Soviet Union, COVID. Is this a major crisis period once again?
Sí. Esto es un momento de crisis por muchas razones. Es decir, la falta de combustible, la situación de la luz, todas estas cosas. Es decir, la persona no puede ni siquiera conservar el poco alimento que pueda resolver. Entonces, los precios suben.
Do you think that the fuel blockade by the United States is making things much worse?
La situación del combustible inmoviliza, te hace, no puedes moverte, tienes que estar te cierra un poco, te limita mucho. Y hay muchas cosas que funcionan a través del combustible. Y entonces, a la vez que no tenemos combustible, estamos prácticamente paralizados. Si en muchos lugares, por ejemplo, de acogida, han tenido que cerrar porque no tienen cómo.
Every economic sector in Cuba is being affected by this blockade, and one of the most obvious casualties is tourism. Sparkling classic cars, typical of virtually every image you've probably seen of Havana and renovated for tours of the city, now stand empty. Their drivers desperate for business. Historic squares are all but empty of the foreign visitors who throng these streets. Souvenir shops and markets are now displaying their wares to virtually nobody but the odd passerby. The tourism industry brought billions of dollars of hard cash to Cuba. That vital foreign currency arriving on its shores is slowly but surely drying up. President Trump's threats, the continuous talk of war, the events in Venezuela and Iran, and the lack of fuel for aeroplanes is taking its toll. The band may still be playing, but they've lost their audience. It's quite astonishing to experience this. From the sky, vast swathes of Havana are enveloped by darkness. People here are not used to this. Remember, these streets are in the center of the city. If there are lights, they're by and large from batteries or energy stored up from solar panels. Normal life after nightfall simply can't continue as normal. People walk through the streets, illuminated by headlights and torches. Others wander around making preparations to go to bed. It is strange, even quite frightening, driving around in this darkness. Cuba powerless to provide its people with power. One of the country's major hospitals is a beacon of light surrounded by darkness. Its generators keep it functioning just. Like the rest of the country, just about functioning is as good as it gets. Just because it's daylight doesn't mean there's power. Some of the power cuts last for days at a time. Some areas are restricted to a single hour in every 24. Petrol stations are now routinely closed. There's not a fuel shortage at these stations. There is no fuel. Queues immediately form when news spreads that a garage has received a small supply of petrol. But it's never very much, and prices have gone through the roof. Cuba's revolutionary heroes still look down from the monolithic buildings and sports stadiums built to celebrate the country's new beginning decades ago. American economic sanctions have combined with the country's own mismanagement to leave many of these structures in disrepair. A lone athlete trains in the country's once formidable center of sporting excellence. The Pan American Stadium is now a crumbling monument to a past era. There's no money to rebuild this. There's no money at all. In the warmth of an early evening sun, young men gather in the square for an improvised game of handball. We're in a small town near Pinar del Rio, a farming community a couple of hours out of Havana. This is typical of most of Cuba's rural communities. There's not much going on, pretty much everyone is poor, unemployment is high, and more often than not, there's no electricity these days. When we arrived, there hadn't been power here for 2 days. When power comes on, people charge their electric scooters and car batteries to run lights in their homes. Many make use of bicycles as well, and of course, horses and donkeys. At sunset, some climb up onto the roofs of their Soviet-era apartment blocks, looking to find a bar of phone signal. They tell us communications with their family and friends in different towns is often impossible for days at a time. Others prepare charcoal fires to cook meagre dinners for their families as the sun drops below the horizon. As night falls, single, weak lights flicker on in the midst of a general blackout. row after row of apartment blocks shrouded in darkness. It will stay like this until sunrise. Right, communities like this one across the whole of Cuba have had problems with power shortages for a long time now, but everyone who lives here tells us it's getting worse since the fuel blockade imposed by President Trump on Cuba has really kicked in. And it affects all of their lives, right? So there's electricity, there's no heating, lighting and to be seen, there's no telecommunications. The pumps that push water around mean there's no running water. In this community, a farming community, they can't afford the fuel to get to the fields to do their farming, and they can't afford to run the farming equipment. The reality of life during this fuel blockade is summed up by the darkness, by the grinding monotony of living without the appliances of modern life. In many ways, Cuba goes back in time every single night. We invite you to come and meet a family who live in this apartment block. Some of them have lights. It's solar power or batteries that they've got. They're on about the 3rd floor, I think, of this apartment. This is their electricity meters. They're not doing anything. Eventually, they're completely stationary. There's no power on at all. And they can often go days without power here. But we're going to come up and see what life's like.
Esto es una batería de 12 volts. O sea, hay baterías más caras o más baratas.
Oscar is a physics and maths teacher. Perhaps unsurprisingly, he's rigged up a system to keep the lights on at home. It's a short-term fix, but it is effective. Oscar and his wife Lise, an English teacher, live here with their son. Oscar takes home about £10 a month as a teacher. All government wages are poor, so he holds down 3 other jobs to try to make ends meet. They aren't happy with their lives, but they don't see Donald Trump as their savior. They prefer Cuba to do better, and the American blockade is making things worse.
Ante el mandato de Trump teníamos problemas, pero esto ha sido peor, mucho peor en todo sentido. Transporte, siembra, los mismos apagones han aumentado cantidad. Es muy difícil mantener la comida en el refrigerador, tenemos que comprar diario, ¿me entiendes? Entonces ha sido mucho más difícil, como nunca he visto.
And you worry about the future?
El futuro puede ser incierto porque no sabemos a qué se pueda llegar a atrever, porque vemos que Venezuela es una potencia en cuanto a esto de lo que es el combustible y nosotros no tenemos nada.
Yo espero que por un problema de que no hay recursos naturales, él nos deje tranquilo y sea todo un problema político.
In another apartment, Jeanette prepares the charcoal to make her dinner for the evening with the help of the light of a torch. She's a pediatric physiotherapist and lives alone in her 2-bedroom flat. Much of her extended family live in the blocks around her in town. Getting by is just a way of life for Jeanette. She'd like more, but there isn't more. Like so many Cubans we've met, she's scared about the future and afraid about what may happen to her country. Donald Trump says he wants to bring about huge changes in Cuba, that the blockade is to try and bring about those changes. Do people in Cuba resent this interference?
Al final, el mismo pueblo es el que ha tenido que tomar todas las consecuencias para el cambio que puede ocurrir. La necesidad ha aumentado. El pueblo es quien lo está sufriendo día a día.
Do you worry about what's going to happen next?
Por supuesto, que vivimos aquí. Somos los que viviremos las consecuencias de lo que pueda ocurrir.
By morning, the town slowly awakes. Another night without power gives way to another day without power. It's relentless. Cuba's economic mismanagement and neglect of infrastructure over decades contributes to this situation. But years of sanctions and the current American fuel blockade certainly has made the power problem here more acute. It's a Sunday, so it's even quieter than usual. Some pass by dressed up in their Sunday best, heading to church. For anyone who does have a job or has a way of finding food, they head out. Horses and carts are pressed into action. People here don't have much, but a short distance away in the countryside we saw the difference between having little to having nothing. The most vulnerable in rural Cuba are old and frankly helpless. Nano and Pancha live on a farm, or rather a shack on farmland. Pancha tells me her state pension is $1.12 a month. That's 83 pence a month. Obviously, nobody can live on this. She and her husband are utterly dependent on their family and help from the community. The Cuban government doesn't like anyone seeing this type of poverty, but it is very real.
Can I ask you, lots of people talk about oil blockades by the United States and that life is much harder now. Does it make any difference to you? Have you heard about those things? Or does it make any difference to you at all, as life was already tough?
No. Hace mala vida, es difícil también. Esto no es fácil, sin corriente, sin con qué alumbrarte de noche. Yo me tengo que levantar 1000 veces, Oscarito, de noche. Ahora en noche me caí en el baño. Dito que no le pegué la de esa la losa. Que si yo me subo por la losa, rebalo y me mato. Oscuro, mijo. Entonces ni una listernita para alumbrarte. Porque el yerno mío tenía ni me lo prestaba, pero está haciendo guardia y no me lo puedo prestar.
Heading back towards Havana, it struck me that there can't be a clearer illustration of fuel shortages than taking a trip on one of Cuba's motorways. We barely see a car. Mostly we pass horse-drawn carts and slow-moving motorcycles and scooters. We pass parched, burning fields, smoke drifting across the road. There's no fire engine to put out these fires. Well, there is. It just hasn't got any fuel. There's barely any traffic on the roads now. Economic highways appear to be redundant for all but the most determined or needy traveller. A reminder of this country's past status can be seen in the magnificence of old Havana, with its beautiful ornate neoclassical mansions, Art Deco buildings, and Baroque churches that marked out Cuba as a special place for hundreds of years. To a degree, it still exists at first glance.
Yeah, it has a lovely feeling about it, that Spanish colonial look. Parts of the centre of downtown in the old city are in good nick. But actually, a little bit more closely in Havana, these are some of the most iconic buildings, hotels, that are actually completely and utterly destroyed, emptied. It looks more like a war zone than a major city, the capital of a country. Sort of, you have to scratch beneath the veneer up here. You don't have to scratch very far. You see just how much trouble Cuba is in.
The truth is, the buildings are neglected and slowly falling into ruin. In the midst of this once magnificent city, many of its people are living in squalor, clinging onto existence in buildings from a different era. It all adds to the sense that this large Caribbean island, a dominant cultural and political symbol, and still regarded by its island neighbours as a regional powerhouse, is being strangled because of its political inclinations that took root here a couple of generations ago. Observers, neutral or otherwise, agree people can't continue to live like this. The current fuel embargo is quite simply collective punishment on a mass scale. President Trump says Cuba is next, but nobody here, and perhaps not even in the White House, have any idea what next means. The merry-go-round of threats, sanctions, blockades, and sometimes negotiations about the future go on. When it stops, is there even a future for this generation? Is there even a plan?